I got home at around 11 p.m. A late night at the office turned into an even later night at the bar. About 4 drinks deep at this point, and I'm tired, just about ready to fall asleep as I stumble through the doorway. I lay down on the couch and reach for my bag of joints, sparking one up as I pull up YouTube on my laptop. I'm in the middle of watching some luxury cruise tour, close to passing out, when I hear the front door open. I sit up and turn my head slightly, just enough to see my roommate coming in. He hangs his jacket in the closet, doesn't say anything, and walks slowly to his room, which is normal enough. I'd been living with him for about 3 months, long enough for me to pick up on most of his tendencies. The guy really doesn't talk unless spoken to, which was far from a problem for me. He also generally kept things clean on his end, never causing much in the way of problems. I really couldn't complain. So, I go back to watching YouTube, and about 5 minutes later, I hear the shower in his room turning on. Once again, nothing strange. At this point, I'm watching bare-knuckle boxing highlights with my eyes half open, maybe 1 or 2 minutes away from passing out. I remember waking up in darkness, my head hurting, my throat dry as hell. I sat up slowly, waiting for the grogginess to settle into something manageable. Once it did, I grabbed my phone, checked the time. Around 3:30 a.m., from what I remember. I was starving, so I got up and began walking towards the fridge. And then I noticed it, a soft but ever-present noise in the background. It took me a few seconds to really recognize what it was. The shower. Suddenly, the events of last night began replaying in my head. Drinking at the bar, Ubering home, laptop, couch, my roommate coming home, the shower turning on. I stood there for a while trying to make sense of it. Maybe he went to bed and forgot to turn it off? I shook my head. There's no way that happened, I thought. Maybe he slipped and fell? Realizing the implications of this, I rushed towards his room but found his bathroom door locked. I began pounding on it. "Hey man, you alright?" No response. I considered kicking the door down but decided to call 911 before I did that. I took my phone out, preparing to dial, when I noticed that I had an unread text. One from my roommate. "Hey man, I couldn't sleep, so I went over to my girlfriend's place. Not sure when I'll be back. Sent 2 hours ago." I look at the bathroom door, then back down at my phone. Everything about this was wrong. First of all, my roommate barely texts me, and certainly never to tell me that he's going out. Second of all, I know for a fact that he's single and has been for a while. And third of all, who the fuck was in the shower then? I tried calling him. No answer. Sent him some texts, but no response. I walked over to his desk and saw that his keys and wallet were still beside his laptop. My head's starting to spin at this point, and I get out of there, go back into the living room, and turn on the lights. I'm pacing around in a circle, trying to follow the plot while also trying to ignore the shower. A noise that I never could have imagined being so dreadful in any context. Sometime later, I hear something vibrating on the kitchen counter. I move towards it and see that it's a phone. My roommate's phone. The panic begins setting in, and immediately I grab my keys and run out of the apartment. I make my way down the hall and take the stairs down to the lobby, but even that doesn't seem far enough away, so I make my way over to the McDonald's across the street. I sit there for a while, considering calling the cops, but for some reason feeling too nervous to do so. But even though there's hardly anybody in there, the place begins to feel suffocating, and I decide to leave, walking back out onto the empty streets. Almost immediately, I get this feeling that I'm being watched, and I feel my gaze drifting up and towards the apartment. Soon, I'm looking at my balcony, and I see somebody standing there, a dark figure standing completely straight, stiff to the point where it nearly resembles a mannequin. But it isn't one. If I look closely, I can see it just slightly swaying. I froze in place, my mind hardly able to understand or accept what it was seeing. It's not my roommate. It's too tall. In fact, it's too tall to be anybody I know, its head nearly scraping the bottom of the balcony above. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't make out any of its details. The darkness and distance may have been enough to explain that away, but there was something about it that drove me towards a different conclusion, that this thing simply possessed no details that could have been observed, that the only element of its composition was that of unadulterated darkness. Of course, my gut instinct was to get the hell away from it, but the voice in my head was telling me that if I were to try and run, this thing would end up following me. I went back into the McDonald's instead, locking myself in the bathroom as I finally dialed 911. I told the operator that somebody had broken into my place, but that I had gotten out of there without them noticing and that they were still in there. It was the story that most accurately represented the situation without making me come across as Bats Hit. The operator told me that they'd be sending somebody over for me to hang tight. I left the bathroom, waiting at the table closest to the exit until I could see the red and blue lights cutting through the darkness. I went outside to meet the cops, looking up at the balcony to find it empty, though the door to the living room had been left open. They pelted me with a bunch of questions that I found difficult to answer. Is the intruder armed? Do I have an idea who it might be? What are their intentions? I told them I didn't know, that I couldn't figure it out, but they just kept on asking. Soon, I was practically yelling at them to go up there and check it out for themselves, and I suppose the terror in my voice was enough for them to begin taking this seriously. They told me to wait by the entrance, and I watched on as they entered the building. I was out there for a long time, growing increasingly anxious at the thought of what they were going to tell me when they came down. A few minutes later, the silence was broken by a single, muffled gunshot. My heart dropped into my stomach, and I continued to wait there, unsure of what to do otherwise. 20 more minutes of silence, and the officers still hadn't come down. Soon, I could hear more of them approaching in the distance. Before I knew it, 4 more cop cars had pulled up around me, and the scene had fallen into chaos. Officers shouting over each other and into their radios, more questions being hurled my way, none of which I was able to answer. The next few sequences were mostly a blur, but I remember the building being evacuated, the tenants frightened and confused as they were ushered outside while the officers became more and more frantic. I remembered hearing more scattered gunshots, some screaming, other noises that were difficult to make sense of. There were a few lapses in my memory after that, but I recall being pushed into the back of a police car. After being driven to the station, I was led into one of the interrogation rooms, where I found 2 nondescript men in suits waiting for me. They didn't introduce themselves and immediately went into a series of questions, each one more bizarre than the last. What company was your roommate employed by? What was the nature of his job? How many different people have been inside your apartment since your roommate moved in? Have you ever heard voices inside the apartment from the hours of midnight to 3 a.m.? Voices that did not belong to your roommate? Have you ever seen a circle of people standing outside of the apartment from the hours of midnight to 3 a.m.? People that were exceptionally tall. And one of the most unsettling ones. Have you ever seen somebody standing at the foot of your bed upon waking up between the hours of midnight to 3 a.m., only for them to disappear moments later? If so, do you remember what they looked like? Any distinct features? As they continued probing me, my mind began conjuring up some of the strange shit that had happened after my roommate had moved in. Shit that I had written off as figments of my imagination, simply because I had no other explanation for them. I did hear the voices, always coming from the room next to mine where my roommate slept. I was always so tired when I heard them, but I do remember it either sounding like a young woman or a man with an extremely deep voice. I could never make out any words. It always sounded like gibberish. And then there was that one time where I went to the bathroom in the middle of the night. Still half asleep, I didn't bother turning the lights on as I entered, but as my eyes began adjusting to the dark, I could have sworn that somebody was already sitting on the toilet, somebody extremely tall. Of course, when I turned on the lights, nothing was there. It was easy to chalk it up as a product of late-night drowsiness at the time, and I had never really thought about it since. After doing my best to give them useful information, the suits spent a good few minutes taking notes on their phones. Once they were done, they sat up quickly, told me that they'd be in touch, and then left the room. A cop came in a few minutes later and told me that since I couldn't return to the apartment, they would set me up in a nearby hotel until they were able to get the situation under control, and that I should stay put until they gave me a call. What happened? I asked him. What did you guys find up there? He stared at me for a long time, not as if he were deep in thought, but as if he held deep aversion for what he was considering telling me. Eventually, he just shook his head. I don't know, he said. I really don't know. I nodded, tried to smile, though I'm sure it didn't come across very well. It's the next day now, and I'm in the hotel. Of course, I couldn't sleep, couldn't really eat. The officer hasn't called me yet. When I try searching up information about the evacuation on the internet, all I can find are articles claiming that it was due to a fire. A fucking fire. Update. I fell asleep, and I just woke up. It's 1 a.m. now, and I can hear the shower. I work at the Lone Star Diner, off the road from Carson City to Reno. Diner name has of course been changed for obvious reasons. More on that later. Why do I work at the Lone Star Diner, off the road from Carson City to Reno? Well, because, kind stranger, my life plans didn't work out. Generally, if you're caught working at a diner past college, specifically one in the middle of nowhere, it might mean that things aren't going so hot. But still, why this diner? Why Lone Star specifically? I'm aware you probably aren't actually asking these questions, but I nonetheless believe they deserve a response. Of all of the diners in the world, what makes Lone Star so special is the pay. The pay is great. There are maybe 10 other diners within a 30-minute drive from where I live. Most of them average out to a little over minimum wage. Meanwhile, Lone Star is whipping up a mean $50 per hour. And that hourly rate is due to one single solitary reason, no matter what anyone tells you. Because of him. My first day on the job was fine, more or less. I'd worked customer service before, so I felt like I could run with the strange surprises that came unique to diners. I was able to adapt to the inconsistency of the rules pretty quickly. Unwritten rules like, some areas in the restaurant need to be spotless at all times. Others, boss lady couldn't give less of a shit about. Serve customers quickly, but not too quickly, asshole. Customers here don't actually like it when you show up too fast. Give them some time to feel the floor under their boots, to miserably stare ahead, and mourn what could have been. You know, diner stuff. They're here because they want to be alone. Pardon the contradiction. Of course, vaguely defined, whispered only by ghosts rules extended to the cooks as well. If you were somehow secretly celebrity chef Marco Pierre White in the flesh, your mandate was to keep your damn prowess to yourself. Your job is to make the classics as decently as possible. Not bad, but not amazing. Just poor enough to be really good. That's what the customers are here for. As the weeks unfolded, I rose, or I suppose crouched, to the occasion quite well. You want intentional, pinpoint precision mediocrity? You've come to the right person. Most of the patrons just wanted coffee and brunch, brought to them at medium speed, with a semi-predictable cadence of waiter or waitress check-ins afterwards. Done, done, and done. Not one for subtlety. One day I finally decided to ask my boss the question in the middle of a shift. I didn't want to ruin a good thing by doubting it, but I would be lying if I said I wasn't a little curious. Not a full look at the gift horse's mouth. More of a skeptical side eye. Why $50 per hour? She didn't even look up from her task at the register, methodically counting out bills. Said it on your first day, you gotta be good at following the rules. And when it's an important rule, you'd better be damn well perfect. High expectations here. I made a face, right? High expectations. You think I'm joking? No, ma'am. I guess why did I even speak up? I just think you're running a really cool operation here. Cooler than you might realize. It's still work, but the whole thing seems fair. Christ, my waffling skills were abysmal. Add that to the list of intentional mediocrity. Booyah! She looked up from her duties and shot me a stern look. I don't run this ship, and following the rules here means that you take care of yourself. I'm sorry. I am your employer, sure, and I'll pay you well to be here, sure, but you should be aware, there is plenty more going on here than just you and this diner. She glanced down at her watch, then sighed. I usually save this speech for the end of the month, but you already caught me halfway through it. So, the Coles notes. If you don't think you have it in you to follow instructions clearly, without protest, and without asking too many questions, then you should leave. Quit. Noir, Nufo. A week's worth of pay on the house. The conversation sputtered shortly after that. I tried to find an opening to ask more about what she meant, but she was closed off to the topic moving forward. And you know what? That was fine. If she wanted me to put my head down and just do the work, I could do that. And work I did. And things were good. Mundane small talk with the customers was fun. My coworkers were friendly, and I was getting paid well. I'd found a place to park the failures of my life, a place to build from. It must have been a Saturday, I think, when I first noticed him, an occupied seat in the far corner of the diner. No idea how long he'd been sitting there and waiting, though he certainly looked patient. I had the strange inkling that he'd been left hanging for quite some time, though I couldn't actually remember seeing him enter. Brown corduroy shirt, short hair, mid-50s it seemed, a reasonably calm smile, normal-looking dude. I started making my way out from the back and headed towards him. Immediately, I felt a tight grip on my arm. It was Melanie, my boss, with a forceful clutch, enough to make me drop my notepad. Her fingers tightened around my forearm, sharply pinching my skin. "Important rules," she said. "What? You remember our chat about rules? Well, this is the most important one. Okay? Okay? That man, over there, in the corner." She motioned to the man who had caught my attention, sitting upright, hands softly clasped together, coy smile across his face. "You don't go up to him. You don't say a word to him. But he's a customer?" Her hold intensified. She was hurting me, almost as if she was taking out some sort of unseen anger on me. "I'd like to ask you right now to be smart enough to not ask questions and just follow instructions. You don't go to his table, you don't talk to him. You can look at him. You can shout across the room at him if you'd like. Though I can't imagine why you'd ever need to do that. But you do not approach him, and you do not take his order." Or a sharp exhale through the nose, a shake of the head, and a glare from my manager. It's different every time, but it ain't pretty. I watched him from the short distance I'd been afforded. It was hard not to. She did too. Unlike the other customers here, I didn't get a sense that he was here to be alone, to reminisce, or to take part in the comfort ritual of a lackluster Eggs Benedict over rye. Instead, I had the sense that he was just curious, mild-mannered, content but curious. My shift ended not too long after, so I didn't actually get a chance to watch him leave. Regardless, the experience of seeing him and learning about the rule he was connected to left a bizarre, dampening feeling on my mood. I liked my job. I liked coming home and unwinding. I didn't mind being in the middle of nowhere. It felt nice to look up at the empty sky filled with stars, to see them shimmer and shine, and even occasionally shoot across. I made a wish that things in my life would stay simple. I started to get a sense of his cadence. He'd usually show up once a month. The rare times I got to see him, I'd try to squeak in the odd question to my boss. Questions like, who is he? Where does he come from? And has anyone spoken with him? All mechanically met with I don't know, and if you're scared, you're welcome to quit. Then, as fate would have it, one day boss lady fell incredibly ill. My coworkers and I had to convince her to go home midway through her shift, her sickness falling uncomfortably within the usual 1 to 3 day window at the end of the month when our customer would typically appear. And of course, there he was right after she went home. To my benefit, the other waiters and waitresses working the rounds were well aware of his presence and knew exactly what to do whenever he arrived. All of them knew to steer clear of him. Nevertheless, driven by a foundational curiosity that I just couldn't shake, I used this opportunity to go for it. I shouted a single thing across the floor, knowing Melanie wasn't there to chide me. "Hello, sir. What brings you here?" I asked him. He turned his head from his fixed position in his seat and put a hand to his ear. "Clever." I said, "What brings you here?" I called out again, a few notches louder this time, garnering some odd looks from our Thursday patrons. To my surprise, he spoke back. I'm not sure why I was expecting his voice to carry the tone of some twisted, demented demon. Maybe the fear Melanie had instilled in me? The man sounded exactly how he looked. "I'm sorry, dear," he said. "I'm afraid I'm not sure what you're saying. Can you come over here and ask me again?" "Nope, I was good. And I don't mean to be rude about the service," he continued. "But it feels as if no one has taken my order for quite some time now." I let the exchange end there, diverting my attention back to the other guests. As always, he'd eventually disappear without fanfare, without the clatter of the entrance bell or any sight or sound of his steps across the diner floor. Our backroom conversations about him remaining dreadfully short while he was there. Just, he's here, and he's gone. And the odd when we really needed to say it. I feel really weird about this. It took me a while to understand where my brazenness to address this strange middle-aged man came from. In truth, I was just afraid. His presence and all of the questions tied to his being at our diner were disrupting this otherwise great arrangement that I felt I had. It seemed right, in the moment, to stand at the very edge of my bravery and say something to him. Of course, now that he was gone, I just felt worse. The next week, I was invited to something pretty interesting at work. I generally have a good amount of visibility into what Melanie, boss lady, does on a daily basis. The only element that remained elusive was her bi-weekly check-in with a particularly sharp-dressed agent-looking fella. There was a pretty consistent presence of state troopers, agents, and similarly uniformed men and women dropping into the diner, though I seldom paid it mind beyond simply noticing it. Midway through wiping down the tables, only an hour or so into my shift, Mel swung by and said, "Hey, want you in the meeting with the big boss, if you have a few." "The big boss?" Sure. Yeah. Coming. Just, if you don't mind me asking, who is?" She let her eyes speak her unwritten rules to me. Questions equals generally bad. "Thank you for the reminder, ma'am." We maneuvered to a back room and sat at a table. Across from us, already seated, was a man in a sharply tailored suit with a subtle earpiece in the aforementioned agent. The table was littered with a small, messy stack of notes, papers, and documents. He made it a point to size me up, staring me down uninterrupted, like a deer to headlights, no concern at all about how awkward he was making it for me. Then he turned to Melanie. "How long she been here?" he asked her in his gruff Western drawl. "6 months, she said. I trust her. I trust her. Yes." He let his eyebrows say, "If you say so," then went on with it. "All right, so apparently Y had a visit from the wandering man last week. You," he said, motioning to Melanie, "were out, but you," attention now shifted to me, "weren't. Give me the lowdown." "The wandering man?" The agent caught the confusion in my eyes. "Jesus, you've told this girl nothing, haven't you?" he said to Melanie. "Sir, I know it sounds weird," she said, "but I personally feel as if the man is almost, I don't know, drawn to curiosity. Like, maybe the less I say to those not already in the know, the bet." "Wandering man," the agent cut her off, "is our nickname for the fella that sits in the corner of your fine little establishment. Or should I say, the state's fine little establishment." "I'm sorry," I asked. "That's correct. The state's. Congratulations, ma'am, you're part of a government operation." The wandering man, not just a cutesy little nickname, but our legal definition of this tricky little problem, is a phenomenon we discovered many years ago. At the time, he just walked the desert landscape, chatting up unsuspecting strangers with bizarre questions. Everything fine, all hunky-dory. A little weird, sure, but nothing illegal. However, sometimes things would happen because of him. Bizarre things, grisly things. I could see Melanie groaning, concerned at the picture being painted. Would this pique my curiosity? "Have you guys, taken him in for?" I almost wanted to cut off my own stupid question, but he ran with it. "Nope, not because we don't want to, but rather because it might not be safe." The cozy mental image I'd held of this diner was starting to fracture. "We have reason to believe that he's a visitor," he said. "From?" I didn't attend another debrief after that. Not because I was barred, mind you. Rather, I just didn't want to know anymore. My gut no longer held curiosity. There was just a low, aching dread there now. The agents and troopers, spaced out and seated amongst the eatery, were now just a glaring reminder of what my dingy diner job really was. The government cavalry would mostly show up around the end-of-month window the wandering man was set to arrive in. When he'd appear, they wouldn't do much more than examine him from their distant tables, subtly scribbling notes into notebooks. He'd always act the same. He would just sit there. He wouldn't give them, or us, the diner employees, much to go on. Speaking of employees, I remembered something Melanie told me after my first month of working here, that the worker turnover at this diner was incredibly high. Knowing at the time what everyone got paid, it made absolutely no sense to me. Now, 7 months into the gig, alongside a completely new set of cooks, waiters, and waitresses from when I'd first started, I'd seen firsthand just how true her statement was. None of the leavers claimed as much. but I'm sure the underlying premise of who the diner was really for became subconsciously clear to them during their time here. And it probably didn't sit all too well with them. I stayed, but not because of the pay. I'm actually not sure why I did. We had a new cast of rookie employees now. The ones who understood the vague terms of the situation, just as Melanie, I, and all former employees did, stuck around. Those who couldn't reconcile the situation with their inherent curiosity naturally filtered out. And then there was Malcolm. It was only his first week. He was a keener.
Mega keener.
He'd bulldozed through a giant list of tasks and was already asking for the next batch of work to chew through. Anything he could get ahead of, anything he could step in for, anything he could learn, he was on it. He wanted to be as helpful as humanly possible. I think the salary of the role for a guy his young age was just too alluring for him. For our part, Melanie and I tried our best to get him to pace himself. We were both giving the spiel now. By this point, we'd more or less perfected it. There are things about this diner that are strange. Rules you will have to follow and not think about. Rules that are concrete, immutable, and non-negotiable, like gravity. He nodded. At that moment, I really believed he was internalizing my words. And if that doesn't work for you, and if you don't think you can take care of yourself, then you shouldn't work here, I continued. There was always a visceral feeling in my stomach whenever I saw the wandering man in the corner during the same week that we were onboarding new staff. I'm sure Melanie felt it too. On those days, Mel and I would both work the till, and if we saw anyone coming out from the back, we'd stop them. With a simple grab of the arm. Malcolm stepped out, and I did just that, a rough grasp of his forearm, just like Melanie had done to me when I'd first started. He recoiled in surprise. "Remember that little chat about rules we just had?" I said. He nodded meekly, as if he was already in trouble. I pointed to the man seated at the far table in the brown corduroy shirt, staring straight ahead, with what I believed at the time, no real reason to be here, and I said, "You will not, under any conditions, serve that man. Don't go up to him, don't talk to him. Pretend he doesn't exist." Malcolm lifted the garbage bag he was holding in his left hand. In my nervousness, I hadn't actually clocked what he was stepping out for. "Just doing garbage duty, ma'am," he said. But, understood. And then he left out the front door with his usual swagger. The dumpster wasn't as close as we would have liked, so I appreciated his willingness to take on this duty so soon into his employment. I turned back to observe the wandering man. We had a crowd of agents in attendance that day, scattered about the restaurant. The man wasn't one to speak up often. Today was an interesting exception. "Officers," he said, "if you have any questions, feel free to join me at the table to ask them." The agents around the room reacted mainly with snickers. "Seriously, if you come sit with me, I'll be happy to spill it all." Truly, even more laughs. But no one bit. And yet he continued pointedly. "I know you're curious, I know you take notes, I know you talk about me. I know you built this establishment for me, I know you." As I reconciled the fact that this was the most words I'd ever heard him string together in succession, I heard the chime of the bell. A door had opened. Malcolm was dusting his hands as he entered through the diner's side door. A door which was situated right beside the table the wandering man was seated at. It all happened so fast. And yet, it played out in front of me excruciatingly slowly, as if there was a moment, a single solitary second, where I could have stepped in. The wandering man dropped any pretext of an exchange with the agents, stopping his sentence midway and adopting a completely new demeanor. He played the role of a low, miserable, tired man and said, 30 visits, terrible service every time, in a pathetic tone just as Malcolm walked by. Malcolm, instinctively, plucked a notepad out from his chest pocket and turned his head to face the man. "Hey, I got you, Chief. I can have him ring something up for you. What are you?" And then Malcolm froze in place, and the wandering man's expression turned Cheshire cat wide. His neck alternated between tensing and fluttering, with what seemed to be undeniable excitement. The man started getting up from the table, and then, immediately, both of them were gone. Malcolm and the wanderer had vanished out of existence entirely. The insanity of the moment was interrupted by the coded language I heard blared over a megaphone. Nonsensical agent speak that has been seared into my memory forever. Alert level black. Wandering target has compromised a civilian. I repeat, civilian has been compromised. And that was that. Melanie quit in the days after. She wasn't mad at me. She told me she always knew she'd leave after the 10th disappearance. Why that specific milestone was required, I have no clue. All I could do from that point was continue to work. On my commutes home or during lunch breaks, I would look up at the stars and put out the wish that Malcolm be brought back home, back from wherever he'd been taken. The debrief with the agents brought me no solace. The exchange with them was simple and short. Where was he taken to? Answered with, he's gone now. With a perpetual dagger in my soul now, I had only the smallest of silver linings, if you can even call it that. A lesson. The lesson that I needed to be even more watchful, even more diligent. And on days when the wandering man was visiting, the only server at the diner. No exceptions. I knew the agents weren't happy about that. None of them said it to me explicitly, but I could tell that they would learn something new about him every time he whisked someone away after a mistake was made. It was a weird, Darwinian setup they had created. We were a zoo they could use to learn more about a specific animal, a specific entity, a specific visitor.
No dice.
They just have to watch him sit now, or wait for him to do something different. I waited for the 3-day stretch at the end of the month that he usually appears in. Things were quiet up until that point. When he finally showed up, it wasn't what I expected. For the first time ever, I saw the wandering man walk right through the front door. In the dead of night, at the tail end of my shift, I was at the till, paralyzed, as he took step after step to close the distance. And then he was right there, standing in front of me, and I was sure, absolutely sure, that I was going to die. He smiled. "Don't worry. I have my own little set of rules I play by," he said. I didn't say a word. This was no man's land right now. "I know you've been curious about me. I've admired it from the moment you first spoke up to address me. Cautious curiosity is a great thing to see in someone, especially in such a reckless species. Please just go. I'd like to answer a question about why I'm visiting. I'm sure you'd like to know why I'm here, right? I'm not curious anymore. I swear I'm not." He laughed. "The answer is really painfully simple. This little game, this little charade I'm playing, it is just so unbelievably fun. Please don't kill me. Please. You truly have a wonderful planet. I will return again soon. Promise. Give me a month, maybe 2 this time." A sincere, kind smile delivered with kind eyes. "I'll come back with a new game." And then he was gone. It took me a minute to realize that there was a cake box sitting on the counter beside me. Maybe it was there the whole time he was speaking to me. Maybe it materialized right after he left. I opened the box to find Malcolm's severed head, a blank expression on his face, sitting on a bed of poorly and confusingly organized flowers, almost as if there was an intention to create a floral arrangement, but no understanding of what something like that would look like. On top of the horrific display, written in an almost childlike handwriting, was a note that read, "I brought him back, just like you wished." The worst thing about being trapped at a diner, in the middle of nowhere, is that you realize that there really is nowhere else to run to. Every single part of our planet is blanketed by stars, by open sky. Someone could drop in any time. There were bright flashes of red in the sky. It's as if someone was waving around a flare light from space, faint but noticeable. We all made UFO jokes and laughed as we nailed our tents into the ground. I knew for sure that there were 5 of us. We have all been friends since early middle school and were celebrating our high school graduation with this getaway camping trip. The flashes of red must have stopped randomly as we made conversation while fixing up our tents. Dave managed to put his tent together the fastest and told us he was going to find some branches for the fire. I remember how he had worked with me at the local gas station last year. We used to do the night shift together, and it had made working at a desolate gas station much more fun than it was supposed to be. There was also Eric in the corner still reading his tent manual, fidgeting with his signature round glasses. I wasn't as close with Eric as I was with the others, but I still remember sitting with him in math class and copying his homework one time. Ava was also there talking with Sally, my cousin. Both had decided to team up and work on one tent at a time. I also have clear memories of them hanging around at school in our usual places. In fact, I even knew Ava's younger brother, as he used to beg to go with us wherever we went. I bring all this up because I'm sure that there were 5 of us including me and that I knew everyone in the group. So Dave had went to get some branches as we pulled out some foldable chairs and set them up around the fire pit. I remember feeling uneasy as the sun set and darkness began to consume the forest. The shadows of trees elongated around us as the minutes ticked by. Eric went to get a flashlight from his bag while we wondered what was taking Dave so long. He appeared soon after, the harsh rustling sounds of the bushes signifying his return. We were all buried in our chairs at this point, covered by our jackets. The temperature had dropped quickly and a slight breeze was beginning to pick up. "Geez, you guys weren't even bothered to pull out a chair for me," Dave said as he arranged all the branches in the pit. We had set up 5 chairs around the fire. I tried to rationalize the situation, but no matter how hard I focused, my head felt like it was underwater. I had perfect clarity up until that moment, but when I tried to focus on why 5 chairs were occupied when Dave hadn't sat down yet, my head seemed to just stop working, as if something was reaching in and pulling out my thoughts. Instinctually, I felt even more uneasy now, and I had placed why. The whole forest had gone dead silent. I looked around at the faces of the others and could tell that they had felt the same. Eric was fidgeting with his fingers, trying to scan around the group and spot the extra person, but it was futile. I scanned every face, each etched in worry and frowning in frustration except for, "It's all right, I'll get the chair myself," Dave said, breaking the silence and somewhat alleviating the tension. I got up and offered to help him. He looked into my eyes and nodded knowingly. We headed away from the fire pit towards the tents, but I kept my eyes glued on our group. "How many people are here?" I whispered to Dave as he looked around and realized that we had indeed only packed 5 chairs. In fact, every person had brought with them their own chair. They were heavy to carry and we wouldn't bring any extra needlessly. "There's 5, right? I mean, there's 5 chairs," Dave replied. His voice wavered as he spoke. "No, I just think maybe one of us forgot our chair," I said. My mind was struggling to address the issue head-on and now sought to find rational excuses instead. I didn't quite feel in control of my thoughts. It felt like swimming in a dream, and if I tried to force myself to think about who the 6th person was, my head would begin to throb. "Yeah, that sounds about right actually," Dave said, relaxing and heading back to the group. When we walked back to the fire pit and circle of chairs, 2 chairs were empty. One for me and one for Dave. Everything was adding up now, even though we all agreed it wasn't before. Sally suggested we were all probably tired after the long hike to get here and probably just needed some sleep. She could have been right. We were all sleep-deprived from waking up very early today to make it on time. Ava brought out the drinks. The whole 6-pack was emptied. We all moved closer to the crackling fire for warmth as we took sips from our cans and reminisced on memories of last year. Ava was in the middle of telling us about that one time she was home alone with weird things happening in her house when I got these sudden chills despite the pleasant warmth of the fire. What felt cozy and safe moments ago felt wrong now, all because I realized that there was a crucial detail I missed. "Who started the fire?" I asked, completely interrupting Ava in the middle of her story and breaking everyone else's immersion. Everyone looked momentarily annoyed until they realized they had no answer. Once again, I scanned the faces staring back at me, all barely illuminated by the light from the fire, all familiar and pale from fear. "Wasn't it you, Dave?" Eric asked. Dave shook his head. "I think the person standing behind Jenny did it," Sally said, looking over at me. I whipped my head around so quickly it hurt. My heart was pounding in my ears. There was nothing behind me except for the encompassing darkness of the woods. Staring at those tall, dark trees behind me made me feel exposed. I felt like a lost bird in a vast field. "Wait, I don't know," Sally said. Her eyes had gone wide and she was shaking visibly. She continued to look around frantically as Ava moved over to her, placing her hands on her shoulders and trying to calm her down. "I think we should leave this place," Ava stuttered. Yes, something just doesn't feel right, but I can't put my finger on it, Dave said. But it's so dark out in the forest now, we'd probably get lost if we leave now, someone else said. Yeah, I think we should stay the night and leave as soon as we can tomorrow, Eric agreed. I tried to protest but realized Eric was right. The woods harbored an oppressive darkness within which navigation would be near impossible. Let's not sleep in our separate tents just to be safe, Sally said. We all agreed. We only brought one-person tents with us, but we could squeeze two if we tried. That way no one would be alone at night. Following this conversation, we all got up and made our pairs. I went with Dave and Sally like always went with Ava. Eric kept complaining that he didn't have a pair, but we reassured him he did. He wouldn't accept it. I feel like at some point we all realized that there were only 5 of us and suddenly we were all huddling up in the middle of the clearing. Why do we keep thinking there are 6 of us here? Eric asked. Sweat was dripping down his face despite the cold. We had nearly left him all alone on his own under the assumption that there was another person. My stomach turned as I squeezed my eyes shut and tried to mentally recap everyone here. My head throbbed, but I kept pushing it. There's me, Dave, Eric, Ava, Sally, and I was pointing at each of them as I said the name. I retched and emptied the contents of my stomach on the ground when I got past Sally. The left side of my head felt like there was a knife stuck in it. My vision was blurry. Dave held me up to stop me from collapsing, and we all wordlessly started to move towards the tents as someone put the fire out. Dave helped me into a tent while the 4 outside discussed what to do. I could only focus on snippets of the conversation as the excruciating pain beating against my skull came and went in waves. Sally had the brilliant idea of arranging 3 tents together so their openings faced together at right angles in a sort of U shape so we could sleep as close as possible and also limit the entrance to our tents. Dave was about to go to help as they worked outside, but I clutched his hand and asked him to stay with me. The tents took some time to arrange. I started to feel a bit better once everyone got settled into their tents. A quick head count confirmed there were 5 of us. Eric would have to sleep in his tent alone, but he was more comfortable with it since all the tents were very close now. Looking back now, I think he was just trying to put a brave face on for us. I regret that moment deeply, letting him sleep in his tent alone. He was always less integrated in our group and knew that none of us would pair with him. Just before going to bed, we all agreed to leave as soon as the sun rose in the morning. I remember taking one last look outside the tent into the forest before trying to fall asleep. The wind had picked up and the tree branches were swaying gently. Beyond our clearing was just pure darkness. It felt like the trees were closing in on me. With the faint moonlight illuminating our clearing, I turned my head to look over at the 2 tents we had left out and saw someone standing next to them. Despite the circumstances, sleep came quickly and easily. Ava's shrill scream woke me up in the middle of the night. Dave and I ripped our tent door open to find Sally and Ava looking into Eric's tent. We pushed them aside. Eric's sleeping bag was rolled up. He was still inside it, his head in the center, face contorted in utter agony. The rest of his body rolled around it with the blue fabric now dripping with dark blood. Dave zipped up the door of the tent. Ava was in shock. Her eyes had become glassy and unfocused. Sally was shaking her repeatedly, tears streaming down her face. Dave picked up his torch and yelled at us to get up and run. We left the campsite behind and entered the trail we had come from. The 5 of us huddled together, Dave leading in the front as he cast his weak flashlight over the path so we could see it. All we had to help us get through this 2-hour trail was a small white circle of light. Even the moon failed to illuminate our surroundings through the dense foliage. Ava tripped and fell, twisting her ankle. We came to a stop. Someone said they knew how to splint it so we could keep going. They dragged her into the woods instead. It happened too quickly for any of us to process. Sally was about to run after Ava when Dave held her back. She struggled and managed to free herself, running into the trees to follow the echoes of Ava's screams. I was about to run after her, but Dave held me by the shoulders and shook me hard. "We need to get out of here, Jenny, please," he said. I hesitated but jolted into motion again when Sally's voice was cut off abruptly. She had been calling out Ava's name as she ran after her. Dave and I continued to run down the trail, trying to get to our car so we could get out of here. There was nothing we could do. At some point, there were 3 of us running on the trail, Dave and I shoulder to shoulder while someone followed us closely behind. "Dave, who's behind us?" I gasped. My heart was threatening to burst through my ribcage and my legs burned. He turned to look at me. Confusion transformed into fear on his face and then into rage. "You keep running," he told me as he produced a pocket knife from his pants. He handed me the car keys, which I nearly dropped. Then he turned around suddenly and jumped at whoever was behind us. I continued to run in fear as the sounds of a struggle grew behind me. I tripped and tumbled through the trail for what felt like hours. I didn't allow myself to stop. I almost cried when the trail ended and I walked out into the familiar car park. Not wasting a second, I ran to the car and started it up, accelerating out of that forest and onto the highway within mere seconds. I'm typing this post out at a rest stop. My phone has finally regained service and I've called 911 to try and explain the situation. I don't think they believe my version of events, but they sent a car my way regardless. As I wait, the sun is finally starting to rise. After I hit the post button on this, I'm going to check why the person in my backseat has been so silent the whole time.